There is a shed at the back of a property outside Haliburton, Ontario, that most people drove past without a second glance for nearly 2 decades. It sat behind a gray farmhouse on a gravel road where the hydro lines cut through second-growth bush, and from the road all you could see was the rusted metal roof and one window that faced north, always in shadow. The door was padlocked, not because anything valuable was inside. At least, that was what everyone assumed, but because the man who owned it didn't want to look at what he'd accumulated and feel the particular kind of helplessness that comes from knowing exactly what something is worth and having no way to prove it. Let me tell you about Wesley Brandt. Wesley Brandt was 53 years old when the thing he'd been waiting for finally happened, though waiting isn't quite the right word. Wesley wasn't waiting the way you wait for a bus. He was waiting the way old timber waits in a frame wall, under pressure, silent, not going anywhere, holding the whole structure up without being seen. He'd spent 26 years as a licensed refrigeration mechanic in Haliburton County, servicing commercial walk-in coolers, dairy farm milk tanks, industrial cold storage units across a stretch of rural Ontario that most people in Toronto couldn't have found on a map without help. He was not the kind of man who spoke about his work as though it were a calling. He said he did it because he was good at it, and because it paid, and because there was something that satisfied him about a system that worked. About pressure differential and superheat and the precise relationship between a compressor's duty cycle and the ambient temperature outside. He could feel when something was wrong in a refrigeration loop the way some people feel a change in weather. He had a wife, Carol, who taught grade 4 in the village and who had married him knowing that dinner conversations would often involve him explaining why a particular expansion valve was or wasn't seating correctly. She had learned to ask good questions. Their daughter, Nessa, was grown and gone to Guelph by the time any of this happened. Wesley was the kind of man people in rural counties quietly rely on without ever quite saying so out loud. The trouble started, or rather, the trouble had started long before Wesley understood it was trouble, with a company called Korvac Refrigeration Systems, out of Barrie. Korvac had the regional service contract for a line of Danish-manufactured commercial refrigeration compressors that had become common across dairy operations and cold storage facilities in central Ontario through the late 90s and early 2000s. The compressors were well built, Scandinavian engineering, tight tolerances, very efficient. The farmers who ran them liked them. The problem was that Korvac held the exclusive parts supply agreement for the Canadian distribution territory, which meant that if a component failed, a discharge valve assembly, a bearing set, a crankshaft seal kit, you called Korvac, and you paid what Korvac charged, and you waited as long as Korvac took to ship. The man who ran Korvac's service division was a fellow named Darren Picard. Wesley had met Darren Picard twice, both times at industry meetings in Barrie. Darren was the type who wore pressed shirts to service meetings and talked about market positioning. He had a salesman's handshake and a way of making every conversation feel like the beginning of a transaction. Wesley didn't dislike him exactly. He just recognized him clearly. The way you recognize a certain type of weather system, the kind that looks clear from a distance, but is already deciding what it's going to do to you. What Darren Picard had built was not a service company. It was a toll gate. Korvac wasn't the cheapest option for refrigeration work, but in Haliburton County and the surrounding region, it was often the only option for those specific Danish compressors. They had the parts. They had the factory-authorized service designation. They had the relationship with the manufacturer that allowed them to be the single source. And they charged accordingly. Wesley had been running his own licensed operation, Brandt Refrigeration Services, for 15 years by then. He serviced what he could. He sourced what he could. But when a call came in about one of those Korvac territory compressors, he had two choices: refer it to Picard's people, or source the parts through Korvac at markup and hope the margin left him anything to show for his time. Most of the time, he referred. He didn't like it. But there wasn't another way, or so he thought. The compressors were not, to Wesley's eye, particularly complicated machines. They used a reciprocating piston design that had been common in commercial refrigeration since the 1960s. The engineering was good, but it wasn't mysterious. What made them a captive system wasn't the technology. It was the part numbering. The manufacturer had used a proprietary designation system that didn't cross-reference to any standard aftermarket catalog. You couldn't look up a Korvac territory bearing by its dimensions and find an equivalent. Or rather, you could if you knew what you were looking at. But most technicians didn't, and Korvac had no interest in helping them find out. Wesley started paying closer attention around 2006. He was servicing a milk cooling tank on a farm near Minden when he pulled the head off a failed compressor to assess the damage. The compressor was one of the Danish units outside his usual territory in a technical sense, but the farmer had called him because Picard's crew couldn't get there for 11 days, and 11 days without a working milk tank in August was not a theoretical problem. Wesley looked at the failed components for a long time. Then he went out to his truck and got his notebook. He didn't write quickly. He drew carefully. He measured with calipers and wrote down every dimension: the valve assembly, the piston geometry, the crankshaft seal configuration. He spent 2 hours on it, more time than the assessment warranted by any billing logic. The farmer brought him a coffee and didn't ask questions, which is one of the things Wesley had always appreciated about farmers. He drove home that evening with 3 pages of notes and a feeling he hadn't been able to name yet. He spent that winter with catalogs. You have to understand what this means, practically speaking. It means sitting at a kitchen table in Halliburton County in January, which is a particular kind of cold that asks something of you, and cross-referencing bearing specifications from a Danish manufacturer's service documents against North American industrial bearing catalogs, and finding, one by one, equivalents that no one had been publicly told existed. It means doing this not because anyone asked you to, and not because there was any immediate money in it, but because the problem wouldn't leave you alone. Carol brought him tea. She looked at his papers occasionally. She asked once if he was working on something. He said he was trying to figure out if someone had built a fence where there didn't need to be one. She said that sounded about right for him. By spring of 2007, Wesley had a working cross-reference for nearly every serviceable component in the Korvac territory compressor line. Not every part. There were a handful of machined housings where the geometry was specific enough that standard equivalents didn't exist. But for the wearing components, the seals, the bearings, the valve plates, the discharge assemblies, he had found every equivalent in the North American industrial supply chain, and he had costed them out. The Korvac markup, on average, was 340% above what the equivalent components cost through standard channels. He wrote that number down. He looked at it for a while, then he built himself a small inventory. He ordered carefully. He didn't announce anything. He started with the highest failure components, the discharge valve assemblies, and the crankshaft seals, because those were the parts that failed most often and cost farmers the most when Picard's people billed for them. He bought through 3 different industrial distributors, so no single supplier had a complete picture of what he was accumulating. He stacked the inventory in his shed. His first service call on a Korvac territory compressor came in the summer of 2008, a cold storage facility outside Carnarvon. A failed discharge valve assembly. The kind of job that would have cost the facility operator nearly $1,200 through Corvac between the part and Picard's labor rate. Wesley Brandt fixed it for $420, including labor. The facility operator, a woman named June Strickland, who ran a berry operation and did not have the personality of someone who surprised easily, looked at the invoice and then looked at Wesley. She said, "How?" He said he'd sourced an equivalent component. She said, "Will it hold?" He said, "For as long as the original would have." She called him 3 weeks later. Not because the repair had failed, it hadn't. She called because her neighbor had a milk tank with a Corvac compressor that was making a sound she described over the phone in precise enough terms that Wesley understood immediately what was happening. That's how it started. He did not advertise. He did not put up a sign. He did not tell Darren Picard that he had spent a winter finding the gaps in a fence that Picard thought was solid. He just did the work, one call at a time, and the calls came in the way rural work always comes, not through channels or campaigns, but through conversations in farm supply stores and across fence lines and at the community events where people talk about practical things, because practical things are what their lives actually run on. The shed filled slowly, not dramatically. This wasn't a story about warehousing, but he kept the key components in stock. He kept the cross-reference binder on his shelf, updated it when he found new equivalents, added notes in his particular tight handwriting that got smaller toward the bottom of each page, as though the thoughts were compressing under their own weight. For about 4 years, things ran this way. Wesley did his work. He charged fair rates. Farmers in the county started routing their Corvac territory calls to him rather than waiting 11 days for Picard's crew to show up at 3 times the price. He didn't get rich from it. He was comfortable. He was useful in the precise way he'd always wanted to be useful. Not because he'd marketed himself, but because he knew something that mattered to people who needed it. Darren Picard heard about it eventually, of course. This was inevitable. Rural Ontario is not a large place, relationally speaking. Word travels the way it always has. Gradually, then all at once, Picard called Wesley's cell in the winter of 2012. Wesley was in his truck outside a farm on Highway 35 when the call came in. He remembers the temperature. He said it was -19. Picard was professional about it, which was in some ways more unsettling than if he'd been angry. He said he'd heard Wesley was doing service work on the Danish line. He said he wanted to make sure Wesley understood the contractual situation with the manufacturer's service designation. Wesley said he wasn't claiming to be factory authorized. He was a licensed refrigeration mechanic, doing licensed refrigeration work. The components were equivalent rated parts for the application. Picard said he'd have his legal people look at the situation. Wesley said that sounded fine. He ended the call and sat in his truck for a moment, -19 outside. The heater running. The farm visible through the windshield, a long white building with a corrugated steel roof and steam rising from the ventilation near the peak. He wasn't frightened. He'd spent enough time reading about aftermarket parts law to understand that Picard's position was genuinely weak in a legal sense. You cannot compel someone to use your parts through a service designation that doesn't create a binding obligation on the equipment owner. You can threaten it. You can send letters. But if the work is licensed and the parts are rated for the application, the fence that looked solid from a distance had never actually been a fence at all. He also understood something else. He understood that Darren Picard had just told him exactly how much he was bothering him. The legal letters came, 2 of them, over 8 months. Wesley's neighbor, a retired family lawyer named Ed Kowalski, who had moved to the county from Scarborough and who liked talking about cases over the fence when Wesley was cutting grass read both letters for free, and told Wesley that the first was a scare document with no actual legal foundation, and the second was the same document with different font. Wesley filed them in a folder. He kept doing the work. In 2014, something changed. He started getting calls from outside the county. He'd been careful, to that point, not to reach beyond what he could realistically service himself. One man, one truck, limited stock. But by 2014, there were operations in Renfrew County and Northumberland County calling him because someone had mentioned his name, and the calls had a different quality to them. These weren't just farm owners frustrated with Picard's pricing. Some of them were facility managers for cold storage operations that ran tens of thousands of cubic feet of refrigerated space, that could not afford 11-day wait times on compressor repairs, that had been paying Corvic rates for years and had started doing the math. Have you ever watched a business start to see itself clearly for the first time? There's a particular moment in it, not triumph exactly, but something quieter than that. A settling. Wesley hired a part-time assistant, a young man from Minden named Cody Firth, who was good with organization and didn't need to be told twice how to do anything. Wesley taught him the cross-reference system. He showed him how to read a service manual against a bearing catalog and find the through line. Cody learned fast. They built the inventory out, carefully, methodically, the same way Wesley had built it from the beginning, not by gambling on volume, but by knowing exactly what failed most often and staying ahead of it. For 2 more years, things were good. And then, in the late spring of 2016, Wesley got a call that had nothing to do with refrigeration. It was from a man named Bruce Armbrust, who ran a cold storage brokerage out of Peterborough. Bruce Armbrust knew people in the refrigeration industry across the province the way people who run brokerages tend to, laterally, through favors and introductions, with a sense for where things are moving before they move. He called Wesley on a Tuesday afternoon, and the first thing he said was, "Corvac." Wesley said he hadn't. Bruce said that Corvac's Barrie office had been quiet and that people were noticing, that a manufacturer's rep from Denmark had been through the territory in March and the meeting hadn't gone well, that Picard had apparently lost a significant service contract with a food distribution company in Simcoe County that had accounted for roughly a third of Corvac's regional revenue. Wesley thanked him for the call. He sat with it for a few days. He didn't tell Carol right away. He didn't change anything about how he was running the operation. He just let the information sit in him the way information sometimes needs to sit before it becomes clear what it means. What it meant, he understood gradually, was this. Corvac's position had depended entirely on the service contract income because the parts markup alone wasn't sufficient to sustain their overhead. Without the big contracts, the business model didn't work, and a business model that doesn't work tends eventually to stop. In September of 2016, Corvac Refrigeration Systems filed for creditor protection. By November, they were in wind down. Wesley found out about the inventory auction through Bruce Armbrust, who called him again on a Wednesday morning with the same unhurried quality that characterized all of Bruce's communication. As though he understood that information delivered too quickly loses half its value, the auction was being handled by a Barrie-based commercial liquidator. Corvac's physical assets, service vehicles, tooling, office equipment, were being sold separately, but the parts inventory, the sealed boxes of Danish Manchester components that had been sitting in Corvac's warehouse because Picard had over-ordered on a contract that subsequently fell through, was being offered as a lot. It was, from a certain angle, a remarkable amount of irony. Wesley drove to Barrie on a Thursday in early December. It was the kind of Ontario December, where the sky is the same color as the road and the cold has a weight to it. He brought Cody with him. They walked through the warehouse with the liquidator's agent, a man named Terry, who had the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen a lot of businesses come apart at the seams and had decided not to feel too much about it. The inventory was substantial: discharge valve assemblies, crankshaft seal kits, bearing sets, piston rings, head gasket materials. All of it in original manufacturer packaging, all of it the proprietary designated components that Picard had built his toll gate around, sitting on wire shelving in a warehouse that was being emptied out by a man named Terry on behalf of creditors who wanted to recover whatever they could. Cody looked at one of the shelf sections and looked at Wesley. Wesley was quiet for a moment. He was doing the arithmetic in his head, not just the cost of the inventory, but the years of service work it represented, the calls he'd be able to take, the operators who'd been paying Korvac prices who wouldn't have to anymore. He said to Cody, "You know what the difference is between a problem and an asset?" Cody said he wasn't sure. Wesley said, "About 15 years of waiting to find out which one it is." He made an offer on the inventory. It was a fair offer. Not exploitative, but not sentimental either. The liquidator's agent called the following Monday. The offer was accepted. Wesley rented a cargo truck. He and Cody drove back to Barrie and spent a day loading the shelves. They drove home on a gray December afternoon, two men in a rented truck on Highway 35, carrying the entire remaining parts supply for a regional refrigeration empire that had lasted 20-something years on the strength of a fence that didn't actually exist. He backed the truck up to the shed behind the farmhouse. Carol came out from the house in her coat, hands in her pockets. She looked at the truck. She looked at Wesley. She said, "How much is in there?" He said, "Enough." She said, "Enough for how long?" He thought about it. He said, "Long enough that nobody's going to need to call anyone else." They unloaded until it was dark. There are things in that shed now that will keep operating for years. Not because Wesley made a lucky bet or stumbled into something, but because he spent 26 years understanding a system well enough to see what everyone else had decided not to look at. The cross-reference binder is still on his shelf, 4 volumes now, updated in Cody's handwriting as well as his own. The inventory is organized in a way that makes sense to anyone who understands how refrigeration systems fail, which is to say it makes sense to Wesley and Cody, and increasingly to the operators across 4 counties who call them before they call anyone else. Darren Picard, from what Wesley has heard through the county channels that carry this kind of information, moved back to the GTA sometime in 2017. He's reportedly in property management now. Wesley doesn't think about him much. What Wesley thinks about when he thinks about this at all is the winter of 2006 and the kitchen table and the catalogs and the particular quality of silence in a rural Ontario house, when the cold is settled in and the work in front of you is the kind that no one is making you do. He thinks about the farmer outside Minden who brought him a coffee and didn't ask questions. He thinks about the discharge valve assembly he pulled off a compressor on a hot August day and held in his hand for a long time, longer than made any practical sense, turning it over in the light. There are things you look at your whole working life and never really see, and then one day you pick one up and you take out your notebook and you start measuring. That's the whole story, really. The rest of it was just time.